Out. All right. Well, we may have a small but mighty group today, but that's all right. Um, there we go. And it's after 10, so I'm going to go ahead. I want to make sure that we have maximized time to have Jim present and talk with us. So, to that end, well, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the May 2025 ARSA Superintendent's Roundtable. And for those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Melissa Sadorf. I'm the Executive Director for the Arizona Rural Schools Association. And it's really my pleasure to introduce someone who brings both deep expertise and a practical lens to complex issues that we face in rural education and in economic development, and that's Mr. Jim Rounds. Jim is the president of the Rounds Consulting Group, which is a firm that's nationally recognized for its work in economic development, tax policy, education research, and fiscal planning. He has helped shape public policy here in Arizona and across the country, particularly in areas like real estate, healthcare, transportation, and education. And so just really pleased to welcome Jim, who's a trusted advisor at the Arizona State Capitol. He's worked very closely with elected officials and leaders from all sectors. And whether he's talking about the impact of tax policy or the value in investing in rural education and workforce training, he really does have a unique ability to connect economic data with real world applications. So please welcome Jim Rounds. Jim, I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. So thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Melissa. And it's good there's a recording because I think that description is the perfect bio for me. So I might need to modify my bio based on that very, very kind introduction. Thank you. And before some of you joined, I was talking with Diane and mentioned how we used to be focusing more on just tax policy and tax credits. And Diane brought us into the discussion of, well, can we find the right balance? And I thought it was going to be more of an adversarial type of an exercise. And it ended up being one of the best brainstorming exercises I've ever had. Went out with Chad Guestin to tour, and we talked about poverty versus like demographics. It's not being Hispanic, it's a poverty issue. But we went through so many neat things, and I think we learned from one another. And then, Diane and I have been friends for a long time. We had regular breakfast strategy meetings, but it's interesting because the approach, the school leadership approach, K-12, even through community colleges and universities, everybody's becoming more strategic and talking about economics and economic development. And so I have about a 20-minute PowerPoint I put together just to give you all an idea of some of the economic constraints. In fact, let me see if I can share the screen. Let me just make sure. Okay.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, let me see if I can put this on. I'm sorry, give me just one second. Can you still see it?
Yep, we're on your first slide.
All right, great. You can never tell, especially when you have multiple monitors up. So just want to talk about stuff at a very high level, but give you enough information on why it is we have an opinion in certain areas. And I'll go through it quickly so we have some time to brainstorm. So talk about some US economic challenges, Arizona. We'll talk about the Arizona budget. And then the exciting part, at least for me, is the education issues, because there seems to be some momentum going forward. And, who doesn't like that? So let's separate the economic base from politics. You have an idea of what happens across the US. And again, this is very, very high level, but I'm hitting on the key data points that you'd want to monitor. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not we're going to be in a recession this year. And the last time I saw the survey, economists had a 60% estimate for a recession occurring this year. When we talk about recessions, people still bring up 2 consecutive quarters of declines in GDP. We haven't actually used that measure for, I think it's been 4 decades now. But this is the actual, this is the short list of things to look at. But I like the one that is the red box. They basically say, here's some stuff we look at when we identify a recession, but we can look at whatever we want. So it's good because they look at a broad variety. So the fact that we had a negative GDP number this last quarter doesn't really mean a whole lot. There were some issues related to imports. People are misunderstanding it. They're completely botching how they're calculating it. That the import issue was supposed to be an accounting adjustment because imports are included in some of the other data points, but nonetheless, we had weaker economic activity. One of my favorites to look at is employment, the quantity change, because it's a very straightforward valuation each month. And so you always hear, okay, we created 150,000 jobs, but it was below the forecast by 20. It was disappointing. Again, the jobs are the jobs. The forecast was an error. It wasn't the jobs number that was an error. The person that did the forecast did a bad job of the forecast. So whenever they compare it to the forecast, I downplay it some. The rule of thumb is if you see the job creation, which was 177,000 this last month, between 150 and 200 is a pretty good number. When you start falling below 100, so when we see fewer than 100,000 jobs being created over maybe 2 or 3 months, especially if it starts to dip to 50, it doesn't just go slowly down. It's kind of exponential. So you see things slide quickly. But this is a decent number right now, but it is likely to be slowing. Leading economic indicators, 10 different factors that evaluate different pieces of the economy. It's been sliding some. So that's not good. Consumer confidence, we're just on the front end, I think, of this plummeting quite a bit. So this isn't the best data. And then you can't really talk about the economy without talking about housing. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, but it's worth looking up. There's, I took the slide out because somebody said they couldn't quite tell what it was, but this animal called a hermit crab, they don't grow their own shells. They go to other shells from other species. So they're always trading up because they'll outgrow their current home and they'll go to the next one. And what they do is they go on a beach and the biggest one looks around and finds the next shell he wants to go to and he'll stand next to it. The next biggest one, it always is perfect queuing, it goes right behind the biggest one. And they end up getting in perfect order from the smallest to the biggest. Well, the biggest then decides to climb out and to upgrade and go to the next size home. All of them all move at the same time. They all move up. What's happening with housing is, what if that hermit crab had a 2.5% 30-year mortgage on his current shell? He's not going to move up. Nobody moves up as a result of having some people in that system not wanting to move up. Just one would break it, but usually it's on the upper end. Well, that's what's happening with housing, because the higher price homes would pencil out a little bit, but we don't quite have the demand, and it's very expensive to subsidize lower price homes. And this impacts everybody, because if parents are having to spend a lot of money on housing, they're spending less money on healthcare and on education materials and support and all sorts of other things that help kids succeed. And just for some context, doing some math, if you have a $500,000 home and you have a 2.5% mortgage, 2.5% 30-year, it'd be $1,900 a month payment. If you wanted to add 50% to the value of your home, go to 750, but with a 7% mortgage, you're increasing your mortgage payment by 130%. You're getting 50% more value, but you're paying 130% more. Under those conditions, why would anybody want to move? That hermit crab is going to stay in his shell and just go to the local Ocean Home Depot and maybe put in an extra room. So there's a lot of things going on at the federal level that have impacted housing affordability, which will be impacting student performance longer term if we don't find some ways of helping. Let's get to federal government policies and the economic consequences. How did we basically get to where we are? And it's a straightforward story for people that are being honest. You can always tell if an economist or a policy advisor is being honest because even though the complicated economic stuff is complicated by definition, it's an easy explanation. It's just following how people behave. So whenever it sounds extra complicated, you know somebody's kind of making up some stuff, but pretty straightforward what's been happening. We had this hangover from the Great Recession from 2008, and we underbuilt by a significant amount for that entire decade in terms of housing. But the economy was slower than it was. COVID hit, and then the federal government, I keep meaning to change that and I keep forgetting. I had to give a presentation for some ASU students, and so I was talking about drunken sailors, so I apologize for that. But the federal government ended up adding about 10 trillion to the national debt over a short period of time, which is a very, very large amount. And interest rates were near zero. So we said, here's a whole bunch of money. We're not going to charge you for it. That's going to push up tax collections at the local level, and it's going to lift incomes up, but only on a temporary basis. And so we saw a lot of permanent changes in state and local government expenditures when in reality, we knew that this was going to be a temporary situation. And one of our clients, like Maricopa County, did a great job where we isolated the temporary money and they spent it on reducing debt, pension debt specifically, and on other one-time issues. So they're in great fiscal shape, better than most. The state didn't do the best job of understanding that a lot of this was going to be temporary. The stimulus wasn't the best in terms of where the money went. It didn't go to who was impacted the most, which were lower income households. And inflation grew. And then the Federal Reserve Board said, you know what? We need to raise interest rates. They're about 3 to 6 months behind when they should have been raising them more slowly. So they raised them really rapidly. And that even caused some bank failures. Now, it's not so much the dollar amount sometimes, it's the delta, it's the change. So we went from a federal government that added $10 trillion to the national debt. And for perspective, during that 4 years, the average GDP was 25 trillion. Ideally, you would like your debt to be no more than half, just a rule of thumb, no more than half of 1 year's worth of GDP. GDP will be close to 30 trillion coming up. So we need to have the debt go from about 35 trillion to 15 trillion to get back down to normal. And this is where I'm going to differ from my conservative colleagues because they're in favor of let's fix the national debt by cutting the budget. There's not enough to cut to resolve that many trillions of dollars in debt. You know how you do it is you invest in increasing productivity, which increases incomes and increases tax collections. Well, how do you increase productivity? You educate people. You use capital that is made by educated people. It all goes back to education in the end. It's not just for workforce, it's for the entire economy. The tariff policy has threw extra shocks in the economy, and the market wasn't prepared for like the scale of the tariffs that we're talking about. There's been a lot of news about how Trump has been potentially coming up with some solutions with China and others. But keep in mind the reason that there were three different groups of countries. One were the smaller countries where we are always having trade imbalances because it's math. It's real easy to work out. Why don't we just have no tariffs on either side? Then you have the middle, more friendly countries, which would be like Canada and the UK, probably the ones that we've alienated the most, though, where I think we'll get there, but it's going to take a little while. And then we had China and Mexico. China was a target because of massive fraud related to intellectual property rights, just pure theft. And so they were trying to say, let's punish them with tariffs. And then the same thing happened with Mexico. It was supposed to be, well, let's reduce, the drug trade. Well, yeah, the president indicated that he made some headway with China, but basically gave up on all of the things that they wanted. So it looks like a victory, but all we did was scare people, and then we're going back to where we were before, but not even fully because the tariffs are still higher than they were before. They just aren't as high as they would have been. So it's like telling somebody, I'm going to raise the price of $100 item to $200. That's not necessary. And then them coming back and saying, I just cut it by $50 for you. Now you're only paying 150. I really helped you. Well, you didn't because you raised the price by $50 still. So it depends on how you describe it. So it pretty straightforward what's going on. Tariffs and economic growth. This is also straightforward. Um, I'm guessing that most of you already know how they work, but just in case, the US would impose a tariff on a country. We can't legally charge the other country taxes. We don't have that ability. So we end up taxing the company within the US that's importing the goods. That means that if we're importing the goods, it's for local consumption. So we're basically paying for the almost all of the tariffs. So when you hear stories of look at all the money we're collecting, it needs to be look at all the money that we're collecting from US taxpayers. This is a backdoor sales tax. A couple of years ago, there was discussion about whether or not Congress wanted to float a national sales tax, and it went down. It was received just a horrible reception. But we basically are doing the same thing here, and this isn't being biased politically one way or another. This is just how it works legally. And then you end up having slower economic growth and higher inflation. Now, the inflation issue is important because we had high rates of inflation, which drove prices up. Now we're in a period where inflation rates are low. It's 2.5%. But unless it goes negative, prices haven't come down. So inflation, if it grows by 2.5% one month, that just means we're paying even higher prices than we were at our peak. So this is one of those situations in economics where you have to actually have deflation in order to get back down to normal, or you have to have extremely low rates of inflation, like 1% for an extended period. But we're not quite there yet. So we still have higher prices that households are having to cover. And I'll have a couple of questions related to the the scholarship program and the funding, because I'm kind of curious how you all have looked at some of this. Now, on the issue related to, and this will impact the same households, it'll impact all households. So the two scenarios that have been thrown out have been mischaracterized. And looking at phones is my favorite way because people in general, think of there's two phones. There's, the Samsung Android, and then there's the iPhone. And the example was, well, what if because of the tariffs, we lure Apple to bring all of its activity back to the US and we're still importing Samsung phones. And the Samsung phone goes from $1,100 to $2,000. Well, we're not realizing these extra tariffs on the iPhone. Why would Apple charge anything less than $1 less than the Samsung phone, or whatever the difference is in terms of the perceived quality value? This is super important to understand because if competitor prices go up, if it costs more to bring in tomatoes from Mexico, then whatever local tomato production we have, those prices are going to go up almost as high. This is a big deal because if we have inflation of 5 to 7% again as a result of the tariffs, that's going to break some families. So I'm getting very concerned about some of the inequity in how we're talking about these things, and the descriptions of them they're either being made by stupid people or people that like to lie. And I don't know which one is worse because it's been an inaccurate description. I'm sorry for being that straightforward, but that's what I'm seeing. So you're going to see some really weird GDP stats for a while. It doesn't mean that we're going to fall into a recession. It's just going to look a little weird. But take a look at that employment number dropping below 100 and then 50. Federal Reserve Board is going to be limited because we're going to have higher inflation from the tariffs and weaker economic activity because of the other stuff that's happening in the economy. That means that when normally you have higher inflation and stronger economic activity, then you raise rates and you slow things down. Well, what do you do if the two factors that you look at are going in opposite directions? You just do nothing. So we might not have the Federal Reserve Board be able to respond as aggressively as they would before. And so we might have things like you only read about in college textbooks like stagflation, where you have high inflation and low growth, which is an unusual situation. I want to cover this because this is how I want us to start talking about opportunities in education. So historically, we've always done better than the US, except for during the Great Recession. And why was that? Well, we had to learn from our history because historically we were focused on job growth. We're always patting ourselves on the back for saying, well, we're in top five for job growth and income growth. And that's fantastic. But our income levels were low. So it might have been growing at a slightly higher rate, but it's the levels that actually matter. It's like with pricing. When you go to the grocery store, does it say how much the inflation rate was on a can of beans, or does it say the price? People respond to the price. But the biggest thing is that the recession being so bad gave us an opportunity to do things different. And that's where we got together with Andy Tobin and Kirk Adams in the House and wrote the Jobs Recovery Package and helped design some of the economic development tools. We tweaked the corporate income tax rate because it was relatively high. We maintained other rates pretty similar, but we created economic development programs and we had support from the Democrats and the Republicans. So it took something big to happen. Per capita personal income as a percentage of the US basically measures the job growth quality. When this number is going down, and ignore the period where it spikes up during just before the Great Recession because that was artificial. But we had what, 3 decades of declines in this statistic. This means the economy was worsening. Look what happened immediately following. Now, you can make some economic adjustments here and there for a few different things to make it like to totally adjust all the noise out of the numbers. It doesn't change the trajectory. It just changes the extent that we have these little lines going up and down a little bit. But public policy matters. But we were put in a spot where we had to do things. We didn't have much of a choice. We have to start becoming honest and mathematical, but just as dramatic as before on how can we improve the economy. I like this slide. I've kept it in forever because it shows just all the different things that make the economy tick. But the ones that are very relevant are workforce, education, productivity, and then of course having a balanced budget, which could be a problem. This was from the JLBC's FAC meeting. But we used to have an estimate for the 27-28 fiscal year, upward around $700-800 million. And now it's much less with revenues coming in below expectations. But it wasn't below everybody's expectations because we knew that when you shift from a high spending government to significant cuts, you're going to have this kind of an impact on tax collections because it all trickles through to businesses and states and individuals. So now we don't have as much money to play with. And what's too bad is that we were involved in the flat tax discussion. We were trying to protect having a higher rate, actually. It was the opposite of what we did when we were fighting against the tax increase. We were actually trying to keep the individual income tax from being cut too much. And I'll get back to that in a second. So doing the math, if you have a severe recession, unless you want to be, so you get this money from three places. You either increase taxes, you reduce spending, or you take money out of what you set aside. So severe recession, which I think for Arizona is not a likely scenario, it's going to be between mid and mild. For Arizona, we'll do better than the US. But I think we're going to need about $1.5 billion. Here's why I'm so frustrated about that, is when we were working to make sure that the cities were going to be held harmless from that income tax cut, we became the troublemakers, which meant that people were asked us more questions. So we got pulled into the whole negotiation and discussion. So we had a little bit of influence. And one of the things that we supported was putting an extra well, we paid off some debt, and then we put an extra $500 million in the state's rainy day fund. We took it from 1 billion to 1.5. That extra $500 million was us saying we're going to need another $500 million as you go from the transitory revenue increases to where it should be. And we were going to be losing part of the revenue base because we weren't going to be able to keep adding $10 trillion to the national debt every 4 years. Well, so we had $500 million set aside to keep current programs moving forward, to avoid cuts. I thought that's going to be more than enough. Well, we ended up spending in a lot of other areas, and the state didn't plan for this well enough. Now they need the full $1.5 billion, not just to maintain current programs and maybe not cut programs. It's just to balance the budget, which is their number one job. So I feel like we went through a lot of pain, lost two clients, high-paying clients over this issue because we didn't want to just say, yeah, the 2.5% flat tax was perfect, when really it was between 3 and 3.5%. And all it's going to be used for is to help balance the budget because other stuff was messed up. Very, very disappointing. And the reason I make a big deal out of this is it shows that no matter how good we are, you are, others about talking about the economic benefits of education, there's going to be other people that are going to have bad information and other people that can mess it up. We could have the best plan in the world, the best strategic plan in the world, the best plan for the next legislative session and what has to be researched this fall and summer. And there's some things that'll just be out of our control. When we started, and I brought this up, I know that some of you have seen this before, I know Diane has. We kept hearing, let's run government like a business. And so we said, okay, well, let's start converting the policy requests into return on investment for taxpayers. And so we started with healthcare projects where it was going to cost, $50 million for a healthcare program, but the economic benefit was going to generate 5 times that amount within 3 years. All right, well, if I was a business, I would make that investment. That's a great return. So we tried to convert it. We tried to get away from the politics and started talking about how do we look out for taxpayers. And there's something for everybody because my far left-leaning friends saw that that meant that we would have extra money to invest in services. My conservative friends were, well, that means we could do additional tax cuts. In reality, we could do both, but you got to figure out where you're deficient. Every tax cut may have an economic benefit, but if you already have very low rates, that economic benefit could be very small. And if it was spent somewhere else, it could have had a bigger economic benefit. So you have to find that right balance. And I just wanted to complain about the 500 million being wasted again. So if I was going to be in any state during the next downturn, it would be Arizona. I think that we're set up, especially with our focus on creating higher wage jobs than we did before. We're in good shape, but there's also more risk to our forecast than people are admitting, and I'll talk about that briefly. So what are some of the issues to look at? There's lots of things that we've been recommending that people work on, but because there's been so much weird stuff going on with just getting a balanced budget, and there's been staff turnover, and it's been just very difficult at the Capitol, people haven't been working on things as much. But there's still plenty to work on. And each of these things, what I found is that I'm big on picturing Venn diagrams in my head or drawing them if I'm giving a presentation and it's not like a PowerPoint. Workforce training and education, it's always the center circle, and the other stuff loops into it. And that's just because productivity increases were the very first economic concept ever brought up, not supply and demand, productivity increases. And like I said before, that's supported by education. I'm going to skip this one. Let me get to description of some education issues. So on the messaging, there's different ways of messaging benefits for education. I really like the latter concept. because it has to do with timing as well, and it has to do with the extent that we invest. So if we don't invest very much, we're basically giving somebody a step stool. So we're helping them climb up 6 inches on a step stool, and they're limited and they can't go any farther because of their academic levels of achievement and what they know in terms of what they can produce. Then we have the option of giving them a short ladder. Yeah, they can climb it higher than a step stool, but they're not going to reach those higher levels of academic achievement and therefore income because we didn't give them that opportunity. And then we can provide a very tall ladder. What I picture it in terms of timing is in the short to midterm, I think that we can go from a step stool to a smaller ladder for some individuals. If somebody's in their 30s or 40s, there might be some ways of shifting to tangential industry. So you bring in some current knowledge base, but then you learn some new things through a workforce training program. And so we can get them to move up on the shorter ladder. But the younger kids that are still in K-12 and that are going to be going into these others, we could be giving them a tall ladder to climb and enabling them to do it on their own to the extent that we can. And we'll have higher levels of academic achievement, and then that'll create more revenue. And so, much like we used ROI in the discussion to get through to people, we've been talking about K-12 innovation. And so, with that group that Chad put together, the brainstorming group, we talked about a sandbox and we talked about can we have a bill maybe that's called the K-12 Innovation Bill? And it would include some stuff that Chad has brought up. He gave me permission to bring these issues up because we're going to see if we can find a way of teaming up on this exercise and even bring in a couple of conservative groups so that it's one of those, it doesn't matter your political party. This is good for the economy. It's good for the household, which means it's good for the student. Um, so if we use the same concept and we talk about innovation, that gets rid of that myth that people in K-12 don't have innovative ideas. A lot of the cases they're just restricted by statute or constitutional issues. And so starting with the sandbox that Chad's been talking about, he brings up the driverless vehicles. And essentially, there were regulations related to you can't do that. And so a sandbox is essentially when you implement a budget, there's a second bill that's called the ORB, the Omnibus Reconciliation Bill. And that allows you to implement things in the budget that might be a little counter to what's in statute for a temporary period, so you don't have to change statute. It's to help implement it. So we needed these companies for the driverless vehicles came with money. And this is the important point. They needed the rules to be loosened a little in order to be successful. So we're thinking, can we have a sandbox? Because that's the terminology that was used on the conservatives on how do we let businesses be more innovative. The challenge, though, is if we have a K-12 sandbox, it's not as if you all have $50 million in every district hanging around like Waymo, and you just need, we need to write, change statute through a couple or three bills that'll be easy to write. So we'll have to figure out what can we do that might have low costs? What can we do that might have a cost but has a good return on investment? We'll have to get very clever with it, but I think ROI is still going to be something that we'll have to look at. In terms of the innovative ideas, there's lots of different things to be talking about. Let me see. I didn't add that slide in. So just real quick, here are some examples, and the best examples that come up are from having conversations with people and just sitting down and chatting, or having groups like this get together and brainstorm. One of the issues that, and Diane knows this from before because we were talking about it, I wanted to get a second counselor in every high school and call him a workforce development officer and fully train them in economic development and workforce training. And then that would help support the regular counselor, but have the other counselor cross-train some. So they each have a focus, but we have two. A lot of these schools have one, and it's impossible to get anything done. Um, we had one district, the district that we were in, that offered to implement it. They said, "We'll find the money. We really like the idea." But I ended up asking them to not do it because we thought if one district was able to find the money to do it, then the expectation would be that every district would have to do it. So it broke my heart to not see that idea come to fruition, but it would have been more of a negative if one district was able to pull it off. So that was held back a little bit. But another one is there's some empty classroom space in a lot of the schools. Well, the governor wanted to spend a bunch of money that they don't have now on childcare because that's a huge issue with working parents, and it also impacts the kids. And if they're impacted, then their academic achievement levels will be diminished. Well, I thought, why don't we have the schools provide lower cost rent for daycare in the old kindergarten, first grade, second grade rooms, whatever. We already have infrastructure set up for picking up kids and doing it for the teachers with kids, the people that work in the district, and also some of the lower income families, giving them a discount. It would cost nothing. It would generate revenue for the schools. But apparently the schools can't charge below market rate rent. And even though the school buildings, it's hard to find an equivalent for market rate rent. Uh, it, Everybody said, well, you can't do that then. And I said, well, tell me why not? Because in statute it says something. I said, hold on right there. Just because statute restricts something is irrelevant because we can change it. If it's in the Constitution, if it's a big enough deal, we can change it. So I don't like to look at we're not allowed to do this. I like to look at it as what would we like to do? And then whatever is keeping us from doing it, let's implement it. So there's all sorts of neat ideas that are floating out there in people's minds. And not one of them is going to be a game changer. But if we stacked all these things up, look at a district that has a school that's almost completely closed and is about to close. And we're not going to get the population numbers back. What if they built, but they raised the old school that really can't be used for anything else and build multifamily development that's affordable for the same people that would be using the daycare. Schools end up benefiting, getting extra revenue. We help the lower income families in the areas. And I guess we can't do that right now because of some statutory constraints that I got to figure out what they are. But these are the things that I like to think about when we think about innovation. And I'm hoping that maybe this group can have some ideas. And then as Chad pursues his effort and we collect more and more ideas, we can have a K-12 innovation package, which would be, the publicity material, the economic analysis, and then actually drafting a bill before the next legislative session starts. And here's just one example that I know a lot of you have seen before, but we have to give examples so that people understand it. And we were tasked by the Board of Regents one time to calculate what would our extra revenues be if we did a lot, if we were like at the 75 percentile. And we said, no, let's make this absurd so people remember it. And Arizona, let's just be average because we're below average. There's a way of poking fun at ourselves, but it got through to more people because they wouldn't have remembered an arbitrary percentage that we might not be able to achieve. Should we be able to become average in academic achievement across the board? Absolutely. In fact, it's inexcusable if we're not. So we monetized that and said every year the state will have an extra $500 million in tax revenues. All right, that's just becoming average. So we kind of gave some perspective on would it cost us less than $500 million a year, which it would continue to escalate, to just become average? I would hope so. If we combine innovation plus proper investment, then that works out well. And just some ideas to tee up, additional innovation ideas, and we don't actually have to have them all now, but if y'all want to collect them, and we kind of start a list of just neat things. If there's a specific proposal that you've already been working on, want your thoughts on the ROI concept and continuing to use it in combination with talking about innovation and others, because the reason that I like this, and this will sound self-serving, but it's really not, is it was last year where a group was trying to show positive ROI from a project, and they made it confusing. They did the math wrong. And one of the lawmakers said, you need to do a rounds ROI analysis. And it was so cool to have my name on the ROI analysis. That meant that it was accepted. That approach was accepted enough where people were looking for us to be a lead on that. And they even, were calling it that. So I feel like a lot of it is, if we're honest with the numbers and the math generally supports more investment in education, then I think we can get through to people. And once they understand it and they buy into it, then they'll either be making recommendations to others on different projects, saying you need to start thinking in these terms, you need to be more innovative. So I think we're getting there, but we just have to keep applying these economic terms. And this is my last slide, but I did want to bring up the ESAs as well. So I got some weird responses. Twitter isn't quite as effective as it used to be, X, in terms of having political discussions and just some friendly debate. It's just not the same anymore. But I was tweeting that on the ESAs, we have to calculate what the students are receiving and compare it to the marginal cost within the district. And I saw, I think it was the Common Sense Institute had a report that said the average scholarship was 3,300, 3,500, whatever it was. But what confused me was the average number of scholarships was like 3 or 3.5. So the dollar amount was closer to 10,000 per student. Well, if the districts are actually losing that amount per student, that's way more than the marginal cost of providing services to the student, which means that the districts must be losing money, so it's negatively impacting the current student base. But that's something that I can't do. That has to be done internally, in the finance department, calculate the marginal cost. And maybe there needs to be a template put together. In fact, that was another discussion I had with Chad about, should we put together a template that shows, here's how you calculate the marginal costs, and during a certain number of years, like, over a short-term period. Longer term, you have to look at average costs. It's a little complicated, but it's not that hard. But these are also the questions that we need to start asking, and we need to be repeating them over and over again, because if you all were able to calculate that your marginal cost was 4,000, and because you have a lot of fixed costs for the rest, and we're giving away 10,000, all right, well, that's a loss of 6 that should be unacceptable. So I feel like there's some messaging that can be done with some fairly simple analysis, and a lot of this can be done internally. You don't have to spend money on consultants and everybody. A lot of it can be done internally within the district. So, I know I covered a whole lot, and it was kind of just throwing things on the screen and seeing what would stick. But these are the things, these are the approaches that I've used on different projects. It's also, we did this on the New Economy Initiative items with the Board of Regents, and helped get the universities hundreds of millions of dollars over that 4-year period where we were doing the ROI analyses of their budget requests. So I know it can work, but you have to have everybody on the same page, and you have to have a common theme. And my last sentence will be, when you look at like a CNN or a Fox News, you hear the same word being used throughout the day. Like they'll say propaganda, or they'll say economic advancement, whatever it is. And then they send that out to everybody, and it's everybody has to use that term. So you know which ones they handed out, because they keep getting brought up every day. we almost need to get to the same point where we keep hitting on the same things. High ROI, productivity. And the reason I'm banging my fist is that I miss people getting fired up enough to bang their fists on a podium at the Capitol. Nothing's more discouraging than my tiny consulting firm not even working on a project and going down to the Capitol and saying that I'm representing myself because I understand this stuff more than the people in the room. And here's why you can't implement this bill. We need way more people to do that, but it's also hard because it's easier when you're a consultant because you don't get fired from your company. You might lose a client or two, like on that other example I gave you. But some of our leaders have to be very careful with what they say. But if we can team up with them on the messaging, maybe they can say, I'm very concerned about this. And then Jim Round's the jerk version for that day will go down and bang his fist and then help it, advance it. So I feel like there's a lot of coordination. And I used to make fun of high school elections uh, and how it's completely different than, real politics. It's like, it's way better. I mean, yeah, two vending machines in every classroom, whatever. But that if politics has gotten so bad, we have to be even more strategic than before. And I'll end it and stop sharing right now. Sorry if I rambled a little bit. There's just so many things going on in my head on what we can be doing. Um, I hope we can make some advancements there.
Wow, thanks, Jed. That was a lot of really, really good information and very timely. I mean, I know that there are leaders across the state that are having these conversations with their governing boards, with their staff. Um, does anyone have any questions? I want to open it up for discussion if there's anyone. Steve, go ahead.
Jim, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm in the Superior Unified School District in Superior, Arizona. In regard to childcare, so what you said on there is if I would rent out my buildings or classrooms, I'd have to charge market value. Is that correct?
That's what we learned because we had to look at short-term rentals on a Sedona project. And the short-term rentals was an issue because it was really a workforce issue. And we were looking for ways of reducing costs for commuters. And the attorneys brought up, and I haven't found it yet, but the attorneys brought up, we can't do that with the education and the government buildings. We have to charge market-based rent. And at first I was discouraged, but I thought, well, let's just change the law. But if you end up hearing something different, though, like if there's anybody that can give a definitive, very clear, like thorough answer, I'd love to be able to read something and find out exactly what we need to do. Because right now we're just collecting ideas and then we'll see what we do deep research into each one. But the attorneys seem pretty confident that we had some restrictions on how we could rent stuff out.
And the other thought to that is, you know, in Arizona, the governor, the legislature, everybody in the state is talking about childcare. Why don't they put some money into it? I mean, the simple solution would be to start funding it again, because if, for example, we had Pinal-Gila County childcare set up in Superior, they cut the funding for that, which was about $300,000, and they can't get it back. And they're looking for other ways to fund that, and they're coming to us and saying, hey, give us some rooms for free and we'll set it up, but there's some other underlying costs that might not make it work for us.
On that one thing that I was trying to tie into it for at least that region in Pinal is we've been working with Andy Tobin on a lot of the solar projects. And one went down recently where it was a smaller scale project and it was near Coolidge, but it was in an area that was zoned for this. It wasn't even a change in how the government designated the land is going to be used, but it failed. These companies want to find ways of participating with the communities. They usually have a lot of money that they can put into stuff. They usually say, do they need some parks anywhere or whatever? And it's like, no. Why don't you do something that's tangential to what your operations are? And one thing that it just hit me now when you were talking is We were talking about a lot of other things like promoting, getting additional amenities in different areas, maybe having some additional tourism promotion monies, but having them contribute some childcare money, daycare money for the working parents on these businesses. And it's not just like the solar, but it's the data center that goes in, then it's the high-tech business that goes in. I'm wondering if childcare could be something that one of our clients or former clients might consider working with you on. Even if it doesn't work for a particular project, kind of like designing a template for how we could make that work later will be well worth the effort. I think there could be some paths forward.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve. Anyone else have questions or issues that they want to highlight and get some feedback on from Jim?
Melissa,
Yeah.
I'll just respond to the question about the market value. Very controversial, but the whole Phoenix L and the ASU Prep Academy kicking them off is all based on that the Prep Academy has never paid market value. And that's why Phoenix L will probably win. So Jim, you might want to, if you want to look into that, or we can talk about it, but that is a specific example of the market value that for districts. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, I was going to go ask something else, but I remember that too. That's right. That's going on currently. So yeah, my other comment, Jim, and I don't know if you know, I mean, healthcare costs are killing us in school districts. They're absolutely killing us, and we can't. For example, my insurance went up 12% for all of my employees. That doesn't allow me to give a raise to those guys. I have to make a choice, one or the other. Is there anything out there that may help us in the future? Because right now that's one of the things I lose sleep over, that and same year funding. So
I can't think of anything that's going to help us. I'm thinking that there's something that's going to completely destroy us though. And that was the Medicaid proposals of just completely gutting Medicaid across the country. It was going to cost the state billions of dollars. We did an analysis, and if there were two different scenarios where they'd be cutting it, and they're still considering it, one would convert it, one would create a downturn similar to a normal recession. The other one would create a downturn with job losses similar to the Great Recession. So one of the things that I bring up in my normal speeches is whatever day, if the federal government implements what they want, which would be a $900 billion reduction so that they can pay for the tax continuation of the tax cut, then that's the day that we started a recession. But I'm really worried about that because it impacts lower income households. And the reason I'm concerned about lower income households is that higher income households have the resources where they can climb that ladder higher. But we need all hands on deck. We're going to, in fact, the next Zoom I have is brainstorming with the Board of Regents. What I want to do for our next assignment is figure out what we're going to be short in terms of our workers and all the different main sectors that we're doing. Because everybody's saying, well, we just need some people to get a technical degree instead of a bachelor's degree. We need every level to move up. We need more people graduating high school. We need more people that were just going to graduate high school to get some additional advanced degrees. We need everybody to move up. We need the foster kids to do better. We need everybody to do better. Unless we monetize that and we put it in context for people at the Capitol and say, this is going to cost you within 10 years, $2 billion a year in tax collections because we have to lower our forecast for high-tech recruitment because we're not keeping up with the workforce and we can't recruit all of the missing kids anymore. So I want to start bringing education and academic achievement into the hardcore economic development discussion of put a fork in these different industries in terms of your current forecast, and we'll show them, here's your regular forecast, here's your revised one with not having enough workers because we didn't take care of educating the kids. That's $2 billion a year. Once they see that, I think it'll make a difference, but that's just, we have each of these assignments usually identifies something cool, but the story is putting them all together.
Tom, go ahead.
Yes, one of the problems that we have is that economically is that so many of our students that are graduating from high school and they don't have the skills to go to the next level, and it's just like a log jam at the next level.
And this is where I become more, I even brought up the term socioeconomic development because I was hoping our governor would embrace that, being the social worker governor. And they haven't used it, so I've been joking. Anybody can have it for $50 if they want it. But the socioeconomic development stuff is going to help. We got to work on, like I was saying, I keep bringing up foster kids because it's just something that I've been very disappointed with the government on. But all of those types of things are at play. And then the fact that we're going to be short means that we have to take full advantage of making sure that these students do have some options, because we're going to need every one of those high school students that weren't going to go any further to go up another 1 or 2 levels in order to keep the current forecast. And if it ends up being my gut feel is that it's going to be a $2 billion a year cost after 10 years if we lower our forecast to lower wage and less high tech because we can't keep up with the workforce. Can we achieve these things if we were able to spend an extra $2 billion? Well, if we spend a quarter of it, we still have a 4-to-1 ROI. That's better than any other investment out there that you could find. This would be something that the private sector would invest in. We're running government like a business. Damn right we're going to spend on education.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. So Jim, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and helping us to connect the dots between economics and the day-to-day realities that we face in education. Really appreciate your time, your candor, and your continued support of education here in Arizona. So for all of you that were able to join us, please, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Jim. I know that he would be very happy to continue the conversation. Jim, what's your contact information?
It's my last name, Rounds, at roundsconsulting.com.
Awesome. So please feel free to reach out. And again, Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, I appreciate letting me participate.
Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.